My good Ceann Corlin, can I place on the record of the Dáil my deep sadness to learn that there is tensions between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil partners in government, and I'm happy to take to my feet as a leader of the opposition. So táim fear buach agus an deis leirt an ábhar tábhachtach siom Franona Ceann Corlin. Since June 2016, when the Brexit referendum result became clear, we have been, as an all-Ireland party and the lead party of Northern nationalism and republicanism, we have been steadfast in stating that Brexit represents the most serious social, economic and political threat to our island in a generation. Right throughout the referendum debate, Ceann Corlin, in Britain, no cognizance was taken of the Irish question or Irish interests, and it's been that way since. And so it was in Westminster on Tuesday night, when the withdrawal agreement negotiated between the British government and the European Union was overwhelmingly rejected. And as a consequence, the Brexit threat to our island remains and arguably has intensified. The backstop, as it's called, remains the only guarantee and our only insurance policy that there will be no hard border on the island, and that the interests of citizens in the north, the majority of whom voted against Brexit, will be protected. So that backstop must be defended, and it cannot be watered down under any circumstances, because opposition to the backstop is not actually grounded in fact. It's being used as a Trojan horse by those who oppose any cooperation with the European Union and Britain as a means of vetoing any withdrawal agreement. That's the reality. The reality also is that unless there is a backstop, there is no way of guaranteeing that there will be no hard border, that the Good Friday Agreement is protected and upheld, and that citizens will continue to enjoy rights that we take for granted today. I think, in fairness to the British Prime Minister, she finally got that after a lot of argument. However, there are many in her party, in the Tories, and those her partners in the DUP who do not. And they have adopted a reckless and frankly ludicrous position, but that's hardly surprising. The level of delusion amongst ardent Brexiteers, I think, is best summed up in the commentary of the DUP leader earlier this week, who enlightened us all that in fact there was no hard border on the island of Ireland, that it was a figment of our collective imagination. Now, this is of course patently untrue and illustrates clearly that Brexiteers are not in the realm of reality. And I'm sure, Tánaiste, that you don't need me to point out just how worrying that is, because as each day passes, we lurch closer to the possibility of a no-deal scenario, and that cannot happen. But if it does, we need a plan. I've made the case here before, and I do so again, that in the event of a no-deal scenario, and I do not wish to see that, it is incumbent on the British government to put the constitutional future to the people of the North in a referendum on Irish unity. I will be speaking to Mrs May tomorrow, and I will advance that case again to her. Because if the people of the North are to be disregarded and have their futures toyed with by the British establishment that does not care about their futures, then the people of the North deserve to have their say, deserve to have their consent sought. In a series of polls, a majority in the North have indicated that in a no-deal scenario, they would in fact support the notion of Irish unity. And it's now time for the government here in Dublin to articulate that they too would wish to see a referendum being held in the event of a no-deal scenario. It's a more than reasonable position, and I believe it's a position that parties here should hold. I also believe it's a position that's understood implicitly and explicitly by leaders right across the European Union. We need not forget that the European Council agreed in April 2017 that the whole of our island would be afforded membership of the European Union in the event of national reunification. So none of us here want a no-deal scenario to transpire. But if that is what happens, if Westminster insists on driving toward a no-deal crash, then a referendum on Irish unity, as provided for in the Good Friday Agreement, must be called, because it is the only sensible, logical, democratic, rational response which would provide a pathway for the North to retain membership of the European Union. And bear in mind, people in the North voted to remain. And in the interim, let's hope that a deal can be reached. However, as I've said, that cannot involve any resiling from the backstop and protections that are on the table. And if Britain insists on Brexit, that's a matter for them. But any agreement needs to recognise, understand and protect the people of this island, our economy and, crucially, our peace process. That means government here in Dublin and leaders at a European level need to stand firm and not move away from or attempt to dilute the backstop. And in the short term, we also need to be prepared for the immediate impact of a no-deal scenario. You briefed us the other night, Taoiseach, on contingency planning in that regard, and thank you for that engagement. But I made this point here yesterday, that your contingency planning focuses almost exclusively on east-west matters, important matters. I acknowledge that we need to protect trade and commerce between our islands, but we also need an adequate contingency plan in place for north-south issues. We saw on Tuesday night yourself, Taoiseach, and Minister Ross at odds about checks on goods crossing the border in the event of a no-deal Brexit. The reality is that Minister Ross was right in what he said, because in the absence of a backstop, if there is a crash, there will be a hard border, and of course there will be checks. And Taoiseach, you and the Taoiseach have evaded this issue time and again, and I appreciate that you don't wish to be seen as a government that even countenances a hard border on the island, but that's what will happen, because that's what the EU's rulebook dictates. So isn't it now time to say out loud that in the absence of a deal there will be a hard border, and to reassert that this is unacceptable and unconscionable for everybody here in the Oireachtas and for the Irish people? You see, you can't media manage that fact, Taoiseach. That's the reality of what would happen. Contingency planning must also include provision for emergency EU funding for vulnerable sectors and regions. In the event of a crash, that's exactly what would happen. Sinn Féin have argued since the Brexit referendum result for the establishment of such a fund and have called on the Government and European Commission to facilitate this. And while government have belatedly begun speaking of such a fund, there has yet to be a formal proposition to the EU. So this needs to happen as a matter of urgency, because Brexit is not an abstraction. It's very, very real. And while much of this debate thus far has naturally focused on the possible or the probable, with much hypothesising, the reality is that this is happening sooner rather than later and will impact on people's daily lives in real ways. Reports today that in the event of a hard Brexit, motorists who cross the border will need a so-called green card. A green card. I mean, I ask you, is clear evidence of this. And apart from that being absurd and frankly annoying, the concept that you need a green card to traverse the island, this is also the type of time-consuming and costly impact that Brexit will have, particularly on border communities, but on businesses and anybody whose work or personal life brings them regularly across the border. This morning, the Minister for Education couldn't give a straight answer in respect of what would happen to students who study in different parts of the island in the event of a hard Brexit. And over the coming weeks, more and more examples of the direct damage of Brexit will come to the fore. So Brexit is as much an issue for those in Derry and Fermanagh, but also for those in Dublin or Cork. It will adversely affect our entire island if we let it, and it's vital that we deal with the challenges on that basis. The Taoiseach, during Taoiseach's questions yesterday, in a very flippant remark, challenged me to lay out Sinn Féin's position on Europe. I'm more than happy to do that, Ceann Comhairle, in a very abbreviated way, because it is an important consideration in the aftermath of Brexit, because lessons have to be learned. As a result of Brexit, the European Union is at a defining point, And as part of the Future of Europe debate, the battle of ideas for the future of the European Union is well underway. While Brexit is the product of a particularly English set of circumstances, we must accept and acknowledge that disillusionment with the European project is widespread. And rather than accept or even contemplate that EU policy is fundamentally flawed and alienating citizens, the European political establishment seems determined to plough on regardless with more of the same. I want to say on the record of the House, on so many dimensions, be it foreign policy and neutrality, be it on the issues of sovereignty, that this is entirely the wrong approach. And I want to challenge the Taoiseach for him to lay out his position on the future of Europe, because he's been very quiet on the issue. Where does he stand on Irish neutrality? Where does he stand in respect of greater fiscal cooperation, as it's called? Where does he stand in respect of sovereignty and tax sovereignty? Because once again we have a report that the European Commission is back on the game and pushing for an end to tax vetoes at a European Council level. And once again, Ireland must say no to this. We have to make it clear that Brexit changes nothing as far as the importance of democratic decision-making and national economic sovereignty are concerned. In fact, I would say that the emergence of Brexit should illuminate it all the more clearly that these things are sacrosanct and must be respected. So in summary, Ceann Comhairle, whatever transpires at Westminster in the coming days and weeks, it's essential that Irish interests are protected, that our economy and our peace process is protected. And I want to ask and urge all political leaders here in Britain, in Europe, to act in the interests of workers, of the working class, of communities, of society, and in the interests of real political stability. The basic protections agreed for Ireland are not to be reopened or renegotiated. If they are, your government, Taoiseach, they will not be forgiven. And if a no-deal situation does transpire, and let me repeat, I do not wish that, but should it transpire, then we need a referendum on Irish unity. That must happen.